In the spring of 1923, deep inside a sealed archive room at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, a small fire broke out. By the time the night staff arrived, the flames had consumed only a single filing cabinet. Inside that cabinet were the field notes, the photographic glass plates, and the topographic sketches from one specific expedition. One single expedition into the heart of the Gobi Desert. The official report, later filed with the museum's trustees, called the loss minor routine. Nothing of scientific value was destroyed, but the men who had actually crossed the Mongolian steppe that summer would spend the rest of their lives quietly telling a very different story to anyone who would listen. They had found something out there, something that did not belong in any geology textbook ever printed. Standing alone in the red sand, taller than any cathedral spire in Europe, were the petrified remains of forests that should not exist, trees the size of modern skyscrapers, stone trunks the width of entire city blocks, and every photograph of them, every measurement carved into the leather field journals, every witness statement signed by the men who saw them with their own eyes, vanished within 24 months of the expedition coming home. Before we go any further into what those expedition members actually saw out there beyond the last caravan trail, do me one quick favour. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so the rest of this investigation reaches you the moment we release it. The expedition in question was officially called the Central Asiatic Expeditions, and it ran in stages from 1922 through 1925. The man in charge was Roy Chapman Andrews, a museum curator who would later become one of the inspirations for a famous adventure movie character every American knows. His official mission was simple: cross the Gobi, map the unmapped, find evidence of the earliest human ancestors, which mainstream scientists at the time believed had originated somewhere in Central Asia rather than Africa. The expedition was funded by the personal fortune of the museum's president, Henry Fairfield Osborn, and by private donors whose names were carefully kept off the public record. Officially, the team made world-shaking discoveries. They were the first Westerners to document complete dinosaur eggs. They pulled the skull of a previously unknown horned dinosaur out of a sandstone cliff. They came home heroes. Headlines in every newspaper from New York to London called them the men who unlocked Mongolia. But the locals along the southern caravan routes had been whispering to Russian merchants, Chinese tax collectors, and Buddhist pilgrims for hundreds of years about something else entirely, something that lived deeper in the desert far past the dinosaur sites. In their language, the place did not even have a normal name. It was simply the place of the standing stones that were once alive. In late June of 1923, according to two surviving accounts written decades after the fact by lower-ranking expedition staff, Andrews diverted the main caravan off its scheduled route. A Mongolian guide had told one of the team's translators about a hidden valley 2 days' ride to the northwest. The guide had been there as a boy. He said his grandfather had taken him to see the stone trees. He said the place was holy, and that no man was permitted to chip pieces off them, and that the wind through them at night sounded like a language nobody alive still spoke. The grandfather, according to the guide, had told him that the standing stones were not stones at all. They were the bones of the old world, the world that came before the sand. The herders in that region, the translator later noted in a private journal entry, did not consider this a legend. They did not present it as a story passed down from imaginative ancestors. They presented it as a simple historical fact. The sand had come. The trees had been stopped. And the ones that did not fall were still out there in the deep desert, waiting for whoever was supposed to come back for them. Andrews, against the advice of his expedition geologist, agreed to make the detour. The detour lasted 6 days. The men who came back from those 6 days did not speak about it openly for the rest of the trip. When the expedition's geologist, a careful and well-published academic, was asked back in New York about what they had seen in the Northwest Valley, he reportedly said only that the formations were unusual columnar basalt. End of statement. He never wrote about them in any of his later publications. He never gave a lecture on them. He died in 1944, and his private papers were sealed by his widow and remained sealed until both of his children had also passed away. If this investigation is already making you question what you were taught about the natural world, do me one more small favour. Hit that like button right now. It is the single biggest signal you can send to push this story in front of more people who deserve to hear it. The descriptions that did survive, smuggled out through letters and through the unpublished memoir fragments of 3 different expedition members, paint a picture that does not match columnar basalt at all. According to those accounts, the valley contained dozens of vertical stone structures rising out of the desert floor. The smallest was around 200 feet tall. The largest, which 2 of the men measured by triangulation using the same survey instruments they had used on the dinosaur cliffs, came in at over 1,400 feet at the base and rose to a broken height of just under 900 feet. The surfaces of these structures were not smooth. They carried what one journal entry called clear evidence of fibrous bark, of growth rings spiralling upward, of root flares splaying at the base into the surrounding sand, the same way an oak root flare splays into a lawn. At the base of the largest formation, partially buried, the men reportedly found what looked like the calcified remains of an enormous fallen branch. The branch alone, according to the surviving sketch description, was longer than 3 city blocks laid end to end. One of the expedition members later wrote in a private letter to his sister that the largest stump made him feel, and these were his exact words, like an ant standing at the foot of something that had once breathed. He described running his hand along the lower section of the trunk and feeling fibres under his palm. Real fibres, not the smooth, glassy texture of cooled volcanic rock. Long parallel grain, the kind you feel when you drag your fingers down the trunk of a living pine. He also described smaller formations scattered around the largest stumps, formations no taller than a horse, with hollow centres and concentric rings clearly visible on the broken surfaces. He counted the rings on one of them. He stopped counting at 8,000. The mainstream geological explanation for any such formation, then and now, is straightforward. Volcanic activity creates columnar jointing as cooling magma contracts. The Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland is the textbook example. Devil's Tower in Wyoming is another. The mesas of the American Southwest, the strange flat-topped mountains of the Drakensberg in South Africa, the stone towers of Zhangjiajie in China, all of these are explained as the product of erosion, of magma cooling, of sedimentary layering followed by uplift. The explanation is taught in every introductory geology course on Earth. But starting in the early 21st century, a quiet community of independent researchers began asking a different question. What if the explanation is wrong? What if every one of those formations, from Devil's Tower to the Giant's Causeway to the Gobi structures, is the petrified remnant of something that was once alive? Trees do not normally grow to 1,400 feet at the base. But trees, ordinary trees, also routinely absorb silica from soil and groundwater. Silica is the same compound that makes up quartz and most beach sand. Given the right conditions, a tree can be completely replaced cell by cell with silica. The result is petrified wood, and we find it on every continent on Earth. The only real question the independent researchers are asking is one of scale. If a redwood 380 feet tall can become stone, why not a tree 1,400 feet tall? And if such trees once existed and once covered this planet, where did they go? And who decided we should stop asking? The 1923 archive fire was the first answer. The second answer came in 1928, when Andrews tried to mount a follow-up expedition specifically to the Northwest Valley. By that point, the political situation in Mongolia had changed completely. Soviet influence had moved in. New permits were required. The application was denied. It was denied again in 1929. It was denied again in 1930. By 1932, the Soviets had effectively closed the entire region to Western scientific access, and they would keep it closed for the next 6 decades. Andrews himself never returned to the Gobi. There is also a quieter parallel story, almost never told in the same room as the Andrews story, involving the Swedish explorer Sven Hedin. Hedin had been criss-crossing Central Asia since the 1890s, and he had heard the same local rumours about the standing stones decades before Andrews ever sailed to China. In 1927, Hedin launched his own joint Sino-Swedish expedition into the Gobi, with German aircraft support and a German meteorologist on his team. Hedin's expedition was abruptly recalled in 1933. The German materials from that expedition, including aerial photographs taken on flights over the southern Gobi, were transferred to Berlin and stored in a Reichsluftfahrtministerium archive. That archive was destroyed in the Allied bombing of 1945. The official inventory of what was inside it was never released. Hedin himself, in his later memoirs, refused to discuss the southern Gobi at all. He would speak freely about Lop Nor, about the Tarim Basin, about every other site he had visited, about the southern desert, only silence. When Mongolia finally reopened in the early 1990s, the maps that Western paleontologists were given did not include the Northwest Valley. The few researchers who tried to find it on their own using the rough coordinates referenced in the surviving expedition letters reported only sand. No columns, no stumps, just dunes, as if something had been deliberately covered over, or as if nothing had ever been there at all. But satellite imagery tells a stranger story. Starting in the late 2010s, see hobbyist researchers combing through publicly available satellite data began flagging anomalies in the southern Gobi. Circular formations several 100 feet across, linear ridges that do not follow any known fault line, shadow patterns at dawn and dusk that resemble nothing in the surrounding terrain. The Mongolian government does not comment on any of it. The Chinese government, which controls the southern portion of the desert, has classified large sections of the area as restricted military zones. Independent expeditions have been turned back at checkpoints hundreds of miles from the suspected sites. Drone overflights are forbidden. The few researchers who have tried to enter on tourist visas have had their equipment seized at the border crossing. Whatever is out there in the deep desert, somebody at a very high level does not want it photographed. And yet the herders still talk. Modern reporters who have spent extended time in the southern Mongolian provinces working through translators still occasionally pick up the old story from older men sitting outside their gers in the evening. They describe a place where the camels will not go. They describe a low whistling sound that the wind makes only there, in a specific narrow valley, and only after dark. They describe their fathers and grandfathers warning them never to take Western visitors in that direction, never to point at the formations on the horizon, never to draw them in the sand. One herder, interviewed in 2019 by a freelance journalist, whose article was rejected by 3 separate publications before finally appearing on a small alternative history blog, said something the journalist included in the closing paragraph. He said the trees know we are looking again. He said they have been patient. He said they can wait longer than we can. For the people who follow this story closely, the implications are enormous. If a forest of megatrees once stood in the Gobi, it almost certainly did not stand alone. Forests on that scale, with trunks that wide, would have required an atmosphere richer in carbon dioxide, possibly a different gravitational regime, possibly an entirely different climate from the one we know today. They would have produced oxygen on a scale that would have changed the chemistry of the ancient atmosphere. They would have supported ecosystems we cannot even imagine. And their disappearance, whether through fire, through flood, through some sudden catastrophe, or through a slow and deliberate process we do not yet have a name for, would represent the single largest extinction event the planet has ever endured. An event that mainstream science has no record of, no name for, and no explanation for. An event that, if the 1923 reports had survived the fire in that New York archive room, we might already be teaching in schools. So here is the question for you. Are the Gobi structures and the Giant's Causeway and Devil's Tower and the mesas of Arizona all just unrelated geological coincidences scattered across an indifferent planet? Or are they the last standing remnants of a vanished biosphere that the modern world has agreed, quietly and collectively, never to look at directly? Drop your honest answer in the comments below. And if you want more investigations into the stories that someone, somewhere, made the deliberate decision to bury, subscribe to this channel right now, so the next one finds you the moment it goes live.